The morning Dorothy Parker accidentally drove through a climate protest and became the most dangerous 78-year-old in Portland was the same morning she realized that retirement had made her soft, but not stupid. If you're watching this video while hiding from your own neighborhood tyrants or activist bullies, drop a comment telling me where you're taking refuge. I guarantee this story will remind you that age and experience can be the most devastating weapons against entitled youth. Dorothy had been making the same drive every Tuesday for the past 6 months, ever since Harold's funeral. Tuesday was grocery day, pharmacy day, the day she forced herself out of the modest downtown apartment that still felt too big and too quiet without her husband of 43 years. At 78, with arthritis making her fingers stiff on the steering wheel and her reaction time not quite what it used to be, driving had become both a necessity and an act of defiance against the creeping helplessness that seemed to lurk around every corner of aging. She'd spent 30 years on the federal bench, the last 15 as a district judge handling some of the most complex constitutional law cases in the Pacific Northwest. Civil rights violations, First Amendment challenges, federal conspiracy cases. Dorothy Parker had seen it all, ruled on it all, and developed an almost supernatural ability to spot bullshit from 100 yards away. Retirement was supposed to be peaceful, quiet, a chance to read novels instead of legal briefs, to garden instead of gavel, to finally take those cooking classes Harold had always suggested. Instead, she found herself navigating a 2015 Honda Civic through downtown Portland traffic, heading toward the intersection of Oak and 3rd, when she encountered what would later be described in federal court documents as a coordinated campaign of civil rights violations disguised as environmental activism. The protesters appeared first as a distant crowd, then as a wall of colorful signs and chanting voices blocking the entire intersection. Climate justice now, their banners proclaimed. End corporate pollution. The elderly must die for climate change. Actually, that last one might have been Dorothy's imagination, but given what happened next, it wouldn't have been out of place. Dorothy slowed her Honda as a young man approached her driver's side window. 28 years old, she would later learn, with the kind of carefully cultivated scruff that suggested rebellion but probably cost more in organic beard oil than most people spent on groceries. Marcus Sterling wore a vintage band t-shirt that had never seen a real concert, expensive hiking boots that had never touched actual wilderness, and the supreme confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for anything in his entire privileged life. "Ma'am, you need to turn around," Marcus announced, tapping on her window with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We're conducting a climate action here. This intersection is closed." Dorothy rolled down her window partially, the way Harold had taught her when dealing with strangers. "I understand you're protesting," she said politely, "but I need to get to the pharmacy before it closes. It's for my heart medication." Marcus's expression shifted from routine authority to visible irritation. "The climate emergency doesn't stop for your convenience, lady. There's public transportation available. Maybe if people like you stopped driving everywhere, we wouldn't be in this mess." People like you. Dorothy had heard that phrase before, usually in depositions when attorneys thought they were dealing with a harmless old woman instead of someone who had spent 3 decades destroying careers built on assumptions and condescension. She felt something familiar stir in her chest. Not anger, exactly, but the cool, calculating fury that had made her legendary among federal prosecutors and defense attorneys alike. "Young man," Dorothy said, her voice maintaining the same courteous tone that had preceded some of her most devastating rulings. "I'm not asking you to stop your protest. I'm asking for 30 seconds to drive through so I can get medication that keeps me alive." Marcus stepped closer to her car, close enough that Dorothy could smell whatever expensive coffee he'd been drinking. "Look, Boomer, I don't know what part of climate emergency you don't understand, but your pills aren't more important than saving the planet. Turn around, take the bus, or walk. Those are your options." That's when the situation escalated from inconvenience to assault. At Marcus's signal, a casual wave of his hand, other protesters surrounded Dorothy's Honda. Someone began rocking the car gently, then more aggressively. Fists pounded on her rear window. A young woman with purple hair and multiple facial piercings leaned over Dorothy's hood and began shouting about carbon footprints and generational warfare. Dorothy gripped the steering wheel, her arthritis-stiffened fingers white with tension. In 30 years on the federal bench, she had faced death threats, armed defendants, and courtrooms full of angry protesters. But she had never felt quite as vulnerable as she did sitting in her compact car, surrounded by people who seemed to view her as less than human. The final insult came when someone she never saw who spat on her windshield. A thick, deliberate glob that ran down the glass like a declaration of contempt. Dorothy put her car in reverse, backed away from the intersection, and spent the next 40 minutes finding an alternate route through residential neighborhoods, her hands shaking slightly with adrenaline and something else, a cold, analytical rage that she recognized from her most challenging cases. She arrived at the pharmacy 17 minutes after closing time. For the next 2 days, Dorothy Parker went without her heart medication while she arranged for a neighbor to drive her to a different pharmacy across town. 2 days of irregular heartbeat, of chest pains that reminded her just how fragile her 78-year-old body had become, of lying awake at night thinking about Harold and wondering if this was how it would end. Not in her sleep, not surrounded by family, but because some privileged activist decided her life was less important than his cause. On the 3rd day, when her heart medication was finally restored and her system stabilized, Dorothy did what she had always done when faced with injustice. She began to research. She opened her laptop, cracked her knuckles despite the arthritis, and started building a case. Because Marcus Sterling had made the same mistake that countless defendants had made over her 3 decades on the bench. He had looked at Dorothy Parker and seen a helpless old woman instead of someone who had spent her entire career learning exactly how to destroy people who thought they were untouchable. Dorothy Parker had always been methodical in her research, a trait that had served her well during 30 years of federal cases and would serve her even better now. The morning after she finally received her heart medication, she settled into Harold's old leather chair with her laptop and began what she privately called discovery, the process of learning everything possible about an opponent before they realized they were being studied. Climate Justice Now presented itself as a grassroots environmental organization fighting corporate pollution and climate change through direct action. Their website featured stirring photographs of young activists chaining themselves to trees, blocking oil pipelines, and staging dramatic protests outside government buildings. The rhetoric was appropriately revolutionary, full of urgent calls to action and apocalyptic warnings about planetary destruction. But Dorothy had spent 3 decades reading between the lines of carefully crafted legal documents, and she recognized spin when she saw it. The first red flag came in the organization's leadership structure. Climate Justice Now was founded and directed by Marcus Sterling, whose biography mentioned his passion for environmental justice and his commitment to frontline activism, but conspicuously omitted any mention of his last name's significance. A quick search revealed why. Marcus Sterling was the son of Richard Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Technologies, a company that had made billions developing cloud computing infrastructure and data storage solutions. The Sterling family compound in Lake Oswego was valued at $12 million. The Sterling Family Foundation had assets exceeding $50 million and made strategic donations to environmental causes, progressive political candidates, and organizations that promoted what their mission statement called sustainable activism. Dorothy cross-referenced the foundation's tax filings with Climate Justice Now's funding sources. The connections were obvious once you knew where to look. CGN received nearly 60% of its operating budget from the Sterling Family Foundation, along with substantial donations from other wealthy families in Portland's progressive elite. These were people who spoke passionately about income inequality while living in gated communities, who advocated for public transportation while maintaining fleets of luxury vehicles, who supported environmental causes from behind the windows of climate control mansions. But the funding sources were only the beginning. Dorothy began mapping Climate Justice Now's protest locations over the past 2 years, using news reports, social media posts, and police incident reports. The pattern that emerged was both obvious and damning. CGN's protests consistently targeted working-class neighborhoods and transportation routes. They blocked bus lines that served low-income communities while avoiding the light rail stations used primarily by affluent commuters. They shut down intersections in neighborhoods like Dorothy's, where elderly residents and service workers lived, while carefully avoiding the tree-lined streets of Lake Oswego and Forest Hills where their donors maintained their estates. When Climate Justice now staged protests outside corporate headquarters, they chose companies like Portland General Electric and Northwest Natural Gas, utilities that provided essential services to ordinary citizens. They never seemed to find time to protest outside Sterling Technologies, despite its massive energy consumption for data centers or any of the other companies owned by their major donors. Dorothy printed out a map of Portland and began marking protest locations with red pins. The pattern was unmistakable, a systematic campaign targeting people with the least political power and economic resources, while carefully protecting the neighborhoods and businesses connected to the organization's funding base. This wasn't environmental activism. It was class warfare disguised as climate action. The deeper Dorothy dug, the more disturbing the picture became. She found social media posts from Marcus Sterling's personal accounts, the ones he thought were private but had been captured by various internet archives. Photos from family vacations in Aspen and the Hamptons. Videos of him driving a lifted Jeep Wrangler through Oregon's wilderness areas. Pictures from a party celebrating his trust fund distribution on his 25th birthday, complete with champagne that cost more per bottle than most people made in a week. This was the young man who had lectured her about carbon footprints and generational responsibility while she sat in a 13-year-old Honda Civic, trying to get medication that kept her heart beating. Dorothy's methodical research revealed other troubling patterns. Climate Justice Now's protests had caused significant economic damage to small businesses in targeted areas. Maria Santos, who owned a small restaurant 3 blocks from where Dorothy had been harassed, had been forced to lay off 2 employees because repeated street closures had decimated her lunch crowd. James Chun, an elderly man who ran a corner grocery store, had seen his delivery trucks blocked so many times that suppliers were threatening to drop his account. These weren't corporate executives or environmental villains. These were working people whose livelihoods were being destroyed by protesters funded by families wealthier than most small countries. Dorothy found records of complaints filed with the city about Climate Justice Now's activities. Hundreds of them. Elderly residents who had missed medical appointments because of blocked streets. Parents who had been late picking up children from daycare because protesters wouldn't allow emergency vehicle access. Small business owners facing bankruptcy because their customers couldn't reach them. The city's response to these complaints was tellingly inconsistent. When wealthy neighborhoods complained about noise or traffic disruption, city officials responded immediately with increased police presence and strict enforcement of permit requirements. When working-class residents complained about Climate Justice Now's activities, they received form letters explaining the importance of protecting First Amendment rights and suggesting alternate transportation routes. Dorothy cross-referenced campaign contribution records and found the explanation. Mayor James Wilson had received substantial donations from the Sterling Family Foundation and related organizations. City council members who voted against stricter protest regulations had also benefited from progressive donor networks connected to Climate Justice Now's funding base. The fix was in at the highest levels of city government, but federal government was a different matter entirely. Dorothy had spent her career in federal courts, where money and local political connections carried less weight than constitutional law and documented evidence. She began researching federal statutes that might apply to Climate Justice Now's activities, civil rights violations, conspiracy charges, tax fraud related to the Sterling Family Foundation's misrepresentation of its charitable activities. As she worked late into the evening, Dorothy felt something she hadn't experienced since Harold's death: purpose. For months, she had been drifting through retirement, unsure how to fill the hours that had once been consumed by complex legal cases and constitutional challenges. Now she had a case again, not just a legal puzzle to solve, but a genuine injustice to address. Marcus Sterling had made a critical error when he dismissed her as just another helpless elderly victim. He had no idea that he was dealing with someone who had built a career on taking down people who thought their wealth and connections made them untouchable. Dorothy Parker had made one strategic mistake in her research, and she realized at the moment she walked into the Portland City Council chambers for the monthly public comment session. She had assumed she could ask reasonable questions about protest enforcement and receive reasonable answers, the way things worked in federal court, where facts mattered more than politics. She had forgotten that local government operated by entirely different rules. The council chambers were packed beyond capacity, unusual for a Tuesday evening session that typically drew maybe 20 residents and a handful of local reporters. Dorothy noticed the crowd's composition immediately. Overwhelmingly young, well-dressed in the carefully casual way that signaled expensive education and family money, many carrying professionally printed signs reading "Defend Climate Activists" and "Stop Criminalizing Dissent." Marcus Sterling sat in the front row, flanked by what appeared to be an attorney and several other climate justice now leaders. He wore a fitted blazer over his vintage band t-shirt, striking the perfect balance between activist credibility and respectability politics. When he spotted Dorothy entering the chambers, he whispered something to the woman beside him, who immediately began typing on her phone. Dorothy had prepared a simple 3-minute statement asking why the city selectively enforced traffic and permit laws depending on which groups were protesting. She had documentation of the disparities, examples of working-class residents whose complaints had been ignored, and questions about the relationship between campaign contributions and enforcement priorities. It was the kind of methodical, fact-based presentation that had served her well in federal court. She never got the chance to deliver it. The moment Dorothy's name was called for public comment, Marcus Sterling stood up. "Madam President," he said, addressing Council President Linda Rodriguez with the confident familiarity of someone who had donated substantially to her campaigns. "I think the community should know that we're dealing with a coordinated attack on climate activism by establishment figures who profit from environmental destruction." Dorothy felt a chill of recognition. This was a classic litigation tactic, attacking the messenger to avoid addressing the message. She had seen it countless times in federal court, usually deployed by defendants who knew they couldn't win on the merits. "The woman who signed up to speak tonight," Marcus continued, "is Dorothy Parker, a retired federal judge who spent 30 years defending corporate interests and suppressing grassroots activism. She's working with fossil fuel companies to criminalize climate action and silence environmental justice advocates." The accusation was absurd. Dorothy had spent much of her federal career ruling in favor of environmental protections and civil rights plaintiffs. But the audience didn't know that. They knew only what Marcus was telling them, and he was telling them with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to being believed without question. Furthermore, Marcus said, his voice rising with practiced indignation, "Judge Parker has been conducting surveillance on climate activists, photographing protesters, and building what can only be described as an enemy's list of young people fighting for their future." Dorothy's documentation of protest patterns was being reframed as sinister surveillance. Her careful legal research was being characterized as corporate conspiracy, and the packed chamber was eating it up, nodding along as Marcus painted her as the villain in a story where wealthy activists were somehow the victims. When Dorothy finally reached the podium, the chamber buzzed with hostile energy. Council President Rodriguez gave her the standard 3-minute time limit, but the countdown felt meaningless against the wall of predetermined opposition she faced. "Thank you, Madam President," Dorothy began, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I'm here tonight to ask simple questions about equal enforcement of city laws." "Climate denier," someone shouted from the audience. "Corporate shill," yelled another voice. Dorothy had faced hostile courtrooms before, but federal judges have gavels and contempt of court citations to maintain order. City council meetings operated more like political theater, where disruption was often tolerated as democratic participation. She pressed on, trying to present her documentation of selective enforcement, but the hostile interruptions made coherent presentation impossible. Every time she mentioned specific examples of blocked emergency vehicles or harassed elderly residents, the audience responded with jeers about privilege complaints and environmental racism. The most disturbing moment came when Dorothy mentioned Mrs. Chun, the elderly woman whose dialysis appointments had been disrupted by protests. A young man in the front row, one of Marcus's inner circle, stood up and shouted, if she cared about future generations, she'd take the bus. The casual dismissal of an 82-year-old woman's medical needs crystallized everything wrong with Climate Justice Now's approach. These are people who claim to fight for justice while showing contempt for anyone who didn't fit their political narrative. Dorothy's 3 minutes expired without her being able to complete a single coherent argument. As she returned to her seat, Marcus approached the podium for his own statement, which the council president allowed to exceed the time limit by several minutes. What we've witnessed tonight, Marcus declared, is a perfect example of how the establishment tries to silence environmental justice. Instead of addressing the climate emergency, they attack the messengers. Instead of acknowledging their complicity in environmental destruction, they try to criminalize the activists working to save the planet. He looked directly at Dorothy as he continued. Judge Parker represents everything that's wrong with the old system, a federal judiciary that protected corporate interests for decades while the planet burned. Her attempt to intimidate climate activists won't succeed because our movement is bigger than one bitter, privileged woman trying to protect her comfortable lifestyle. The audience erupted in applause. Council members nodded approvingly. Local reporters scribbled notes that would undoubtedly frame the evening as a victory for environmental activism over establishment resistance. Dorothy sat in her chair, surrounded by hostile faces, and felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: complete political isolation. In federal court, facts mattered. Evidence mattered. Legal precedent and constitutional principles provided frameworks for reasoned argument. But this was pure politics, where narrative trumped truth, and whoever controlled the crowd controlled the outcome. As the meeting concluded and the chamber emptied, Dorothy remained in her seat, thinking about what had just happened. Marcus Sterling had outmaneuvered her completely, using her own reputation and experience against her, turning her legal background into evidence of corruption rather than expertise. But he had also made a crucial error. By publicly naming her, by making her a target, by turning their conflict into a matter of public record, Marcus had given Dorothy something she needed: documentation. Everything that happened tonight was on video, preserved in public records, evidence of a coordinated campaign to silence criticism through intimidation and character assassination. Dorothy smiled slightly as she gathered her papers. Marcus Sterling thought he had won tonight's battle by controlling the narrative and mobilizing his supporters. What he didn't realize was that he had just handed her the ammunition she needed for a much larger war. In federal court, Dorothy Parker had never lost a case where she had right, evidence, and patience on her side. And Marcus Sterling had just given her all three. The morning after the city council debacle, Dorothy Parker did what she had always done when facing a formidable opponent. She stopped thinking like a victim and started thinking like a prosecutor. Over 30 years on the federal bench, she had seen countless defendants make the same fatal mistake Marcus Sterling was making now, assuming that winning one battle meant they had won the war. Dorothy's apartment overlooked downtown Portland, and from her kitchen window, she could see protesters gathering in the park across the street. They weren't there by coincidence. Marcus had decided to make her a symbol, which meant he was about to learn why federal judges develop such thick skins and such long memories. She pulled out her laptop and began building what she privately called the file, a comprehensive dossier that would have impressed the FBI investigators she had worked with throughout her career. But first, she needed allies who understood the federal system and could move in circles where local political connections meant nothing. Her first call was to Janet Morrison, a federal prosecutor she had worked with on several high-profile civil rights cases. Janet was now chief of the Criminal Civil Rights Section for the District of Oregon, and she owed Dorothy several favors from cases where Dorothy's rulings had provided crucial legal precedents for federal prosecutions. "Dorothy Parker," Janet said when she answered, "I was wondering when you'd call. I've been following the news coverage of your little activist problem." "It's not little anymore," Dorothy replied, "and I think it might be federal." Janet's tone sharpened immediately. "Tell me everything." Dorothy laid out the pattern she had discovered, the discriminatory targeting of vulnerable communities, the coordination between Climate Justice Now and city officials to avoid enforcement, the tax fraud potential in the Sterling Family Foundation's activities, and a systematic harassment campaign that had followed her city council appearance. The targeting patterns alone could support a federal civil rights investigation, Janet said after Dorothy finished her presentation. If you can demonstrate that they're systematically denying equal access to public accommodations and government services based on economic status and age, that's actionable under federal law. I can demonstrate it, Dorothy said. I've mapped 2 years of protest locations, documented the enforcement disparities, and identified the victims. What I need is someone with subpoena power and federal jurisdiction. Janet was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. This would be a significant federal investigation. Are you sure you want to go down this road? Once we start, there's no controlling where it leads. Dorothy thought about Mrs. Chun missing her dialysis appointments, about Maria Santos laying off employees, about elderly neighbors afraid to leave their apartments because of protesters with bullhorns. I'm sure. Then you need to meet Sarah Kim. She's FBI, specializes in domestic terrorism and civil rights violations. She's been monitoring several activist groups that have crossed the line from protest into harassment. Your Climate Justice Now might fit her profile. The meeting with Agent Kim took place in a coffee shop in Beaverton, far enough from downtown Portland to avoid curious eyes and recording devices. Sarah Kim was younger than Dorothy had expected, maybe 40, with the kind of focused intensity that reminded Dorothy of the federal prosecutors she had worked with on her most complex cases. Agent Morrison briefed me on your situation, Kim said without preamble. What you're describing fits a pattern we've been tracking in several cities. Wealthy activist organizations using harassment and intimidation to suppress opposition while claiming First Amendment protection. Dorothy handed over a flash drive containing everything she had compiled: financial records, protest maps, victim statements, documentation of selective enforcement, and evidence of coordination between Climate Justice Now and city officials. Kim reviewed the material on her laptop, occasionally asking clarifying questions about sources and methodology. After an hour, she looked up with the expression of someone who had found exactly what she was looking for. This is substantial, Kim said. The financial analysis alone suggests multiple federal violations. But what really interests me is the targeting pattern. We've seen similar operations in Seattle and Denver. Wealthy activists systematically harassing working-class communities while claiming to fight for social justice. Is it enough for a federal investigation? Dorothy asked. It's enough to start one, Kim replied. But I need more than documentation. I need witnesses willing to testify, evidence of interstate coordination, and proof that this goes beyond protected political speech into actual civil rights violations. Dorothy smiled. I can provide all of that, but I'll need federal protection for the witnesses. These people are scared, and they have good reason to be. Kim nodded. We can arrange that. But there's something else you should know. Marcus Sterling isn't just a local problem. His father's company has federal contracts for cloud computing services. If we can connect Climate Justice Now's activities to any federal fraud or corruption, this becomes a much bigger case. Over the next 2 hours, Dorothy and Agent Kim developed a comprehensive investigation strategy. Kim would use federal resources to examine Sterling Technologies' government contracts and the Sterling Family Foundation's tax filings. Dorothy would continue documenting Climate Justice Now's activities while building a network of witnesses willing to testify about discriminatory targeting and harassment. The plan required patience and precision, exactly the kind of methodical legal strategy Dorothy had perfected during her federal career. Marcus Sterling was playing short-term politics, trying to intimidate opposition through mob tactics and media manipulation. Dorothy was building a federal case that would destroy his organization and potentially send him to prison. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Kim asked the question Dorothy had been expecting. Why are you doing this? You could just move away, avoid the hassle. You're retired. You've earned the right to a peaceful life. Dorothy thought about Harold, about the quiet retirement they had planned, about the garden they would never plant together. Then she thought about Mrs. Chun and Maria Santos and all the other people who couldn't fight back against privileged activists who thought their noble goals justified ignoble tactics. Because someone has to, Dorothy said finally. And because Marcus Sterling made the mistake of picking a fight with someone who spent 30 years learning how to destroy people who think they're untouchable. Agent Kim smiled. Then let's destroy him properly. Federal court, federal charges, federal prison. The way the system is supposed to work when it's used by people who actually understand it. As Dorothy drove home through downtown Portland, she passed another climate justice protest blocking traffic at a different intersection. This time, instead of frustration or fear, she felt only cold satisfaction. Marcus Sterling had no idea what was coming for him, and by the time he figured it out, it would be far too late to stop it. Within 48 hours of her meeting with Agent Kim, Dorothy Parker found herself at the center of a federal investigation that would have impressed the organized crime prosecutors she had worked with during her most challenging years on the bench. But first, Marcus Sterling decided to escalate his harassment campaign, apparently unaware that every action he took was now being documented by federal agents with unlimited patience and very long memories. The protesters appeared outside Dorothy's apartment building at 6 in the morning, armed with bullhorns, drums, and professionally printed banners reading Dorothy Parker, enemy of climate justice and federal judges equals corporate tools. They chanted slogans about environmental racism and generational warfare, while elderly residents tried to navigate around them to reach medical appointments and grocery stores. Dorothy watched from her kitchen window as her 83-year-old neighbor, Mr. Washington, stood confused and frightened at the building's entrance, clearly unsure how to get past the crowd of angry young people blocking his path to the bus stop. When he finally worked up the courage to ask for passage, one of the protesters, a young woman with bright green hair and multiple facial piercings, began lecturing him about his carbon footprint and complicity in environmental destruction. It was exactly the kind of scene Agent Kim had said she needed. Documented evidence of climate justice now systematically targeting and harassing vulnerable elderly residents who had nothing to do with environmental policy or corporate power. Dorothy activated the recording app on her phone and began documenting everything from her window while texting updates to Agent Kim. The federal response was swift and professional. Within an hour, FBI surveillance teams were positioned around the building, capturing video evidence of the harassment, while federal prosecutors began building civil rights violation cases against individual protesters. Marcus Sterling had given them a gift: clear documentation of discriminatory targeting based on age and economic status, conducted in coordination with a funded organization with interstate implications. But the morning's events also revealed something Dorothy hadn't expected. Marcus Sterling's operation was far more sophisticated than a simple local activist group. The protesters knew details about Dorothy's federal career that weren't public knowledge. They chanted specific case names and judicial rulings, information that would have required significant research and inside connections to obtain. When Agent Kim called that afternoon, her tone was grimmer than before. "We've been monitoring the communications around your building. This isn't spontaneous grassroots activism. Someone fed these protesters detailed intelligence about your judicial record, your personal history, even your husband's death and your medical conditions." Dorothy felt a chill that had nothing to do with Portland's autumn weather. How detailed? They know about your heart medication. They know about your arthritis. They know about Harold's cancer treatment and your financial situation. This is the kind of background intelligence that takes resources and connections to develop. The implications were disturbing. Marcus Sterling wasn't just running a protest organization. He was conducting opposition research with the thoroughness of a political campaign or corporate intelligence operation. The Sterling family's wealth and connections apparently extended beyond simple environmental activism into genuine surveillance and harassment networks. "There's more," Agent Kim continued. "We've been analyzing the financial flows through the Sterling Family Foundation and related organizations. This goes beyond tax fraud. We're seeing coordination with similar groups in Seattle, Denver, and Minneapolis. Same targeting patterns, same harassment tactics, same financial structures. This appears to be a coordinated interstate operation. Dorothy understood the implications immediately. Interstate coordination meant federal jurisdiction. Multiple cities meant federal conspiracy charges. The systematic targeting of vulnerable populations meant federal civil rights violations. Marcus Sterling had built exactly the kind of operation that federal prosecutors specialized in dismantling. Over the next several days, Dorothy worked with Agent Kim to identify and protect potential witnesses throughout Portland. Mrs. Chun agreed to testify about missed medical appointments, but only under federal protection after protesters began showing up outside her dialysis clinic. Maria Santos was willing to discuss the economic impact on her restaurant, but she was terrified that Climate Justice Now would target her employees and customers. The breakthrough came when Dorothy received an unexpected visitor. Michael Torres, a former Climate Justice Now organizer who had grown disgusted with the organization's tactics and was ready to become a federal witness. "I joined because I believed in fighting climate change," Torres explained as he sat in Dorothy's living room, flanked by 2 FBI agents. But Marcus Sterling isn't interested in environmental protection. He's interested in power and control. The targeting isn't random, it's strategic. "We specifically went after elderly residents in working-class neighborhoods because Marcus said they were politically expendable and wouldn't fight back effectively." Torres had kept records, internal communications showing how Climate Justice Now selected targets, financial records demonstrating the coordination with wealthy donors, and evidence of the research operation that had provided detailed intelligence about Dorothy and other perceived enemies. "The surveillance isn't limited to Portland," Torres continued. "Marcus has been building files on potential opponents in multiple cities. Judges, prosecutors, business owners, anyone who might challenge the organization's tactics. He calls it strategic opposition mapping, but it's basically stalking and harassment on an industrial scale." Agent Kim reviewed Torres's documentation with the focused intensity of someone who had found the keystone evidence for a major federal case. The internal communications alone showed clear coordination across state lines, deliberate targeting of protected classes, and systematic violation of federal civil rights laws. "This changes everything," Kim said after Torres finished his presentation. "We're not dealing with a local activist group that got out of hand. We're dealing with a coordinated criminal enterprise that uses environmental activism as cover for systematic harassment, tax fraud, and civil rights violations." Dorothy felt the familiar satisfaction of a complex case finally coming together. All the pieces were falling into place. The financial evidence, the witness testimony, the documented targeting patterns, and now the insider information about Climate Justice Now's actual operations and interstate coordination. "What's the timeline?" Dorothy asked. "We're ready to move," Agent Kim replied. "Federal warrants, coordinated raids, simultaneous arrests in 4 cities. Marcus Sterling and his inner circle will face federal conspiracy charges, civil rights violations, tax fraud, and interstate commerce violations. We're looking at potential sentences of 10 to 20 years. As Torres was escorted out under federal protection, Dorothy reflected on how completely the situation had reversed. 3 weeks earlier, she had been a helpless elderly victim, surrounded by angry protesters and dismissed by local officials. Now she was the center of a federal investigation that would dismantle a criminal organization and send its leaders to federal prison. Marcus Sterling had made the classic mistake of thinking that wealth, youth, and political connections made him untouchable. He was about to learn that federal prosecutors and federal judges operate by entirely different rules than local politicians and activist mobs. The morning Marcus Sterling decided to stage his Portland climate shutdown was the same morning Dorothy Parker realized that 30 years of federal experience had taught her something invaluable. The most dangerous moment for any criminal organization is when it believes it has already won. Marcus had spent weeks escalating his harassment campaign, convinced that he had successfully intimidated an elderly victim into submission. What he didn't know was that every action he took was being carefully documented by federal agents who were building one of the most comprehensive civil rights cases in Oregon's history. Dorothy stood at her kitchen window, watching FBI surveillance teams position themselves around downtown Portland while Marcus's supporters began gathering in Pioneer Square for what Climate Justice Now was billing as their most ambitious action yet. The irony wasn't lost on her. Marcus had chosen this moment to commit his most serious federal crimes in full view of law enforcement agencies that were already building cases against him. Agent Kim had briefed Dorothy on the federal strategy the night before. "We're going to let him do it," Kim had explained. "Every federal crime he commits today will be documented by multiple surveillance teams. Every civil rights violation will be captured on camera. Every conspiracy charge will be supported by real-time evidence. By the time we're finished, Marcus Sterling will have personally demonstrated every element of federal prosecution we need." The genius of the plan lay in its simplicity. Federal authorities wouldn't interfere with the protest itself. Climate Justice Now had First Amendment rights, even if they consistently abused them. But the moment Marcus and his organization crossed the line from protected speech into criminal activity, federal agents would be there to document everything for prosecution. Dorothy had spent the previous week helping federal prosecutors prepare for what would essentially be a live demonstration of criminal conspiracy. She had provided detailed analysis of constitutional law precedents, helping identify exactly where Climate Justice Now's tactics moved beyond protected protest into actionable civil rights violations. Her experience with complex federal cases had proven invaluable in designing an investigation that would withstand any First Amendment challenges. The protest began at dawn, with Climate Justice Now supporters fanning out across downtown Portland to block major intersections, bus routes, and emergency service corridors. Marcus had promised his followers the most comprehensive shutdown in the organization's history, and he was delivering exactly that, along with enough federal evidence to support multiple felony convictions. Dorothy's phone buzzed with updates from Agent Kim as federal surveillance teams documented the coordinated violations. Intersection at 3rd and Morrison, complete blockade of emergency vehicles, documented refusal to allow ambulance passage. That's federal civil rights violation number 1. Another text, bus route disruption on Powell, specifically targeting low-income transit users while maintaining access to wealthy neighborhoods. Civil rights violation number 2. The pattern Dorothy had identified in her research was playing out in real time, with federal agents capturing video evidence of every discriminatory targeting decision. Marcus Sterling was personally directing the placement of protesters, and federal surveillance was recording him specifically ordering blockades that would impact vulnerable populations while avoiding areas where wealthy donors lived. But the most damning evidence came when Marcus encountered real emergency situations during the protest. At 10:30 a.m., an ambulance carrying an elderly stroke victim became trapped in traffic created by the Climate Justice Now blockade at 5th and Yamhill. The paramedics radioed for assistance, explaining that every minute of delay increased the risk of permanent brain damage for their patient. Marcus Sterling's response was captured on multiple cameras and recording devices. "The climate emergency doesn't stop for individual medical emergencies," he announced to his followers and the gathered media. "Sometimes people have to suffer so that future generations can survive." Agent Kim later told Dorothy that Marcus had just committed federal civil rights violations on camera while demonstrating the exact callous disregard for vulnerable populations that would support federal conspiracy charges. But Marcus wasn't finished providing evidence for his own prosecution. When Portland Fire Department trucks were blocked from reaching an apartment building where smoke had been reported, Marcus personally stood in front of the lead vehicle and refused to move. "This shutdown doesn't have exceptions," he declared. "If people wanted emergency services, they should have thought about that before destroying the planet." Federal agents documented 15 separate instances of emergency service interference, each one constituting a distinct federal civil rights violation. Marcus Sterling had personally participated in 12 of them, providing prosecutors with enough evidence to support federal conspiracy charges that could result in decades in prison. The most revealing moment came when a reporter asked Marcus about the impact of the shutdown on elderly residents and working-class families who depended on public transportation and emergency services. Marcus's response demonstrated exactly the kind of discriminatory intent that federal civil rights laws were designed to address. "Look," Marcus said, clearly comfortable with cameras rolling. "These communities have been complicit in environmental destruction for decades. They drive cars instead of taking buses. They live in inefficient housing. They consume resources without considering the impact on future generations. Sometimes you have to target the people who are part of the problem to create the political pressure needed for real change." Dorothy watched the live news coverage from her apartment, knowing that Marcus had just confessed to systematically targeting vulnerable populations based on their economic status and age, exactly the kind of discriminatory intent that would support federal hate crime charges in addition to civil rights violations. Agent Kim's final text of the day was succinct. "We have everything we need. Federal warrants approved. Coordinated arrests scheduled for tomorrow morning. Sterling and 12 associates will face federal conspiracy charges, civil rights violations, emergency service interference, and organized criminal activity. Estimated sentences, 10 to 25 years federal prison." As evening fell and Marcus's supporters finally dispersed, Dorothy reflected on how completely the situation had transformed. 6 weeks earlier, she had been a helpless elderly victim, trapped in her car while angry protesters spat on her windshield and denied her access to life-saving medication. Now she was the key witness in a federal investigation that would dismantle a criminal organization and send its leaders to federal prison for decades. Marcus Sterling had made every mistake that Dorothy had seen countless defendants make during her federal career, underestimating his opponent, escalating beyond legal boundaries, believing that political sympathies would protect him from legal consequences, and most critically, assuming that federal law enforcement operated by the same rules as local politics. Tomorrow morning, Marcus would discover that federal agents don't care about campaign contributions, political connections, or activist credentials. They care about evidence, constitutional violations, and justice. And Dorothy Parker had spent 6 weeks helping them build an ironclad case that would end Marcus Sterling's criminal career permanently. At 6 a.m. on a crisp Thursday morning, federal agents executed coordinated raids across 4 cities, while Marcus Sterling was still asleep in his Lake Oswego mansion, dreaming of yesterday's protest triumph and planning even more ambitious climate actions. Dorothy Parker was awake, sitting in her kitchen with a cup of coffee and her phone, waiting for Agent Kim to confirm that 3 months of careful preparation had culminated in federal justice. The first raid targeted Climate Justice Now's headquarters in a converted warehouse in southeast Portland. FBI agents armed with federal warrants seized computers, financial records, communications equipment, and detailed files that Marcus's organization had maintained on their targets, including a comprehensive dossier on Dorothy that contained personal information that should have been impossible for civilians to obtain. Simultaneously, federal agents executed search warrants at Sterling Technologies' corporate offices, seeking evidence of the coordination between Marcus's activism and his father's business interests. What they found exceeded even Agent Kim's expectations. Detailed communications showing how Sterling Technologies had used Climate Justice Now's activities to target competitors while protecting the company's own environmental violations from scrutiny. The Sterling Family Foundation's offices yielded the most damning evidence of all: internal documents showing how the foundation had systematically funded activities that violated its tax-exempt charitable status while maintaining elaborate shell corporation structures designed to hide the family's direct involvement in Marcus's harassment campaigns. But the moment Dorothy had been waiting for came when federal agents arrived at Marcus Sterling's personal residence with arrest warrants charging him with federal conspiracy, civil rights violations, organized criminal activity, and emergency service interference. Agent Kim had arranged for Dorothy to listen to the arrest via encrypted communication, knowing that this moment represented the culmination of everything they had worked toward. Marcus's response to his arrest was exactly what Dorothy had expected from someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "This is political persecution," he shouted at the federal agents as they placed him in handcuffs. "I'm an environmental activist fighting climate change. You can't arrest people for protesting." The lead FBI agent, a veteran of organized crime prosecutions, responded with the kind of patience that comes from decades of arresting people who think their causes justify their crimes. "Mr. Sterling, you're being arrested for systematically violating the civil rights of elderly and working-class residents, coordinating criminal activities across state lines, and interfering with emergency medical services. Environmental activism doesn't provide immunity from federal criminal law." As Marcus was being processed at the federal courthouse, simultaneous arrests were taking place in Seattle, Denver, and Minneapolis, where local Climate Justice Now affiliates had been conducting identical targeting operations against vulnerable communities. The coordinated nature of the arrests demonstrated the interstate scope of the criminal enterprise and supported federal conspiracy charges that carried potential sentences of decades in prison. Dorothy's phone rang as federal agents were inventorying the evidence seized from Marcus's personal computer. Agent Kim's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had built an ironclad federal case. "We found communications detailing the entire operation," Kim reported. Marcus maintained detailed files on targets in all 4 cities. The discriminatory targeting wasn't incidental. It was strategic policy. He specifically directed his followers to focus on elderly residents and working-class neighborhoods because he believed they were politically powerless and wouldn't fight back effectively. The evidence went beyond simple harassment into genuine criminal conspiracy. Marcus had been coordinating with wealthy donors to identify targets who threatened their business interests, then using Climate Justice Now to harass those individuals into silence or submission. Dorothy's case was just one example of a systematic pattern that had affected hundreds of victims across multiple states. "There's more," Agent Kim continued. "The financial investigation shows that Climate Justice Now was essentially a front operation for the Sterling family's business interests. They were using environmental activism to attack competitors, suppress opposition, and maintain political control while claiming tax exemptions for charitable activities." As news of the arrests spread throughout Portland, the community response revealed how completely Marcus had misjudged public opinion. Instead of outrage about federal persecution of environmental activists, local media coverage focused on the victims who had been systematically targeted by Climate Justice Now's harassment campaigns. Mrs. Chun gave a televised interview describing how protest blockades had delayed her medical treatments and endangered her health. Maria Santos explained how coordinated harassment had nearly forced her restaurant out of business. Elderly residents throughout downtown Portland shared stories of intimidation, blocked emergency services, and systematic targeting that had made their lives miserable for months. The political fallout was swift and comprehensive. Mayor Wilson, who had protected Climate Justice Now from local law enforcement, suddenly found himself under federal investigation for his role in enabling the organization's criminal activities. City council members who had dismissed community complaints about the protests were forced to explain their connections to Sterling family campaign contributions. But the most satisfying moment for Dorothy came when federal prosecutors held a press conference to announce the charges against Marcus Sterling and his associates. U.S. Attorney Patricia Chun, no relation to Dorothy's elderly neighbor, stood before a room full of reporters and delivered exactly the kind of measured, fact-based presentation that had characterized Dorothy's own federal career. This investigation demonstrates that environmental activism, like any other form of political expression, must operate within the boundaries of federal law, Chun announced. When activist organizations systematically target vulnerable populations, coordinate criminal activities across state lines, and use harassment to suppress civil rights, they become criminal enterprises subject to federal prosecution. The federal charges were comprehensive and devastating. Marcus Sterling faced 47 separate counts, including conspiracy to violate civil rights, organized criminal activity, tax fraud, emergency service interference, and interstate transportation of stolen property. Each charge carried potential sentences of 5 to 20 years in federal prison, with the conspiracy charges alone sufficient to ensure that Marcus would spend decades behind bars. Dorothy watched the press conference from her apartment, surrounded by neighbors who had gathered to witness the conclusion of their shared ordeal. "Mr. Washington," The elderly man who had been harassed while trying to reach his bus stop raised his coffee mug in a toast. "Here's to Dorothy Parker," he said with genuine gratitude, who reminded us that experience and patience can defeat youth and arrogance every time. As federal agents continued processing evidence and identifying additional victims, Dorothy reflected on the lesson that Marcus Sterling had learned too late. Federal law doesn't recognize special exceptions for people who believe their noble goals justify ignoble tactics. And when you target someone who understands federal law better than you understand local politics, you're likely to discover that justice delayed is not justice denied. It's justice with compound interest. 6 months after Marcus Sterling's arrest, Dorothy Parker sat in the federal courthouse where she had spent 30 years of her career, but this time as a witness rather than a judge. The trial of United States versus Marcus Sterling and Associates had drawn national attention as one of the most comprehensive federal prosecutions of activist-related crimes in recent history. What had begun as an elderly woman being harassed at a traffic intersection had evolved into a landmark case that would reshape how federal law enforcement addressed systematic targeting of vulnerable communities. Federal prosecutor Patricia Chun had built her case with the methodical precision that Dorothy recognized from her own judicial experience. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records documenting the conspiracy, communications proving interstate coordination, video footage showing civil rights violations, and witness testimony from dozens of victims across 4 cities. Marcus Sterling's defense attorneys had attempted every possible strategy to minimize their client's culpability, but federal evidence doesn't care about political sympathies or activist credentials. The courtroom was packed with representatives from the communities that Climate Justice Now had systematically targeted. Mrs. Chun sat in the front row, flanked by other elderly residents who had suffered through months of harassment and intimidation. Maria Santos was there with several small business owners whose livelihoods had been threatened by coordinated protest campaigns. Federal agents filled the remaining seats, along with reporters covering what legal experts were calling a precedent-setting case for civil rights enforcement. Marcus Sterling looked diminished in his federal defendant's jumpsuit, a far cry from the confident activist who had dismissed Dorothy's concerns about heart medication while spitting on her windshield. Federal detention had apparently given him time to reflect on the consequences of systematically underestimating elderly victims and federal prosecutors. His expensive attorneys had managed to negotiate plea agreements for several of his associates, but Marcus himself faced the full weight of federal justice. When Dorothy took the witness stand, she felt the familiar comfort of a federal courtroom where facts mattered more than politics and evidence trumped emotional appeals. Federal Judge William Harrison, who had taken over Dorothy's former seat on the bench, maintained the kind of orderly proceedings that allowed truth to emerge through careful questioning rather than theatrical performance. Prosecutor Chun walked Dorothy through her initial encounter with Climate Justice Now, the systematic research that had revealed the organization's discriminatory targeting patterns, and the careful documentation that had enabled federal authorities to build their comprehensive case. Dorothy's testimony was precise, factual, and devastating. Exactly the kind of methodical presentation that had made her legendary during her own federal career. Judge Parker, Prosecutor Chun asked, "In your professional opinion, based on 30 years of federal experience, did Climate Justice Now's activities constitute a coordinated criminal enterprise?" Dorothy looked directly at Marcus Sterling as she answered, "Yes. The evidence shows systematic targeting of protected classes, interstate coordination, financial fraud, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. This wasn't environmental activism. It was organized criminal activity disguised as political protest." Marcus's defense attorney attempted to challenge Dorothy's credibility during cross-examination, suggesting that her age and health issues had affected her judgment and memory. It was exactly the kind of mistake that had destroyed countless attorneys during Dorothy's judicial career, attacking a federal judge's competence in front of another federal judge. Judge Harrison's intervention was swift and decisive. "Counselor, Judge Parker's mental acuity and professional competence are matters of federal record spanning 3 decades. Unless you have specific evidence to challenge her testimony, I suggest you focus on the facts of this case rather than personal attacks on a distinguished federal jurist. The defense strategy collapsed entirely when federal prosecutors presented evidence seized from Marcus Sterling's personal computers and communications. Internal documents showed that Marcus had specifically researched Dorothy's background, identified her as a potential threat to his organization's activities, and coordinated the harassment campaign designed to silence her opposition. One email, sent to Climate Justice Now coordinators in multiple cities, was particularly damning. The old judge thinks she can use her establishment connections to shut us down. Time to show her what happens when privileged boomers try to criminalize environmental activism. Make her life miserable until she backs off or moves away. Federal prosecutors also presented evidence of the financial conspiracy that had funded Climate Justice Now's activities. The Sterling Family Foundation had systematically violated its tax-exempt status by funding illegal activities while maintaining shell corporations designed to hide the family's direct involvement. IRS investigators testified about hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent tax deductions claimed for activities that violated federal law. The interstate coordination evidence was equally comprehensive. Federal agents had documented identical targeting strategies in Seattle, Denver, and Minneapolis, where Climate Justice Now affiliates had received funding and direction from the Sterling organization. Phone records, financial transfers, and coordinated timing of protests demonstrated a level of organization that supported federal conspiracy charges. When the jury retired for deliberations, legal experts predicted quick convictions on most charges. The evidence was simply too comprehensive and the federal presentation too professional for any other outcome. Marcus Sterling had provided federal prosecutors with everything they needed to demonstrate systematic civil rights violations, organized criminal activity, and interstate conspiracy. The verdicts came after less than 8 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all 47 federal charges. The jury foreman, a retired teacher who reminded Dorothy of her late husband Harold, read each verdict with the kind of measured dignity that federal courtrooms were designed to promote. Marcus Sterling's face remained impassive, but his expensive attorneys looked like people who had just watched their client receive what amounted to a life sentence. Federal sentencing guidelines for organized criminal activity, civil rights violations, and interstate conspiracy typically resulted in decades in prison. Marcus Sterling, at 28 years old, was facing the possibility of spending the rest of his productive life in federal custody. His associates, who had accepted plea agreements, would serve shorter sentences but still face federal prison terms that would end their careers and destroy their reputations. The community response was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive. Mrs. Chun hugged Dorothy outside the courthouse, tears in her eyes as she thanked the woman who had refused to be intimidated by wealthy activists who thought elderly victims wouldn't fight back. Maria Santos presented Dorothy with a framed photograph of her restaurant, which had not only survived the harassment campaign, but was now thriving with community support. Local news coverage focused on a lesson that federal prosecutors had emphasized throughout the trial. Environmental activism, like any other form of political expression, must operate within the boundaries of federal law. When activist organizations systematically target vulnerable populations and coordinate criminal activities across state lines, they become criminal enterprises subject to federal prosecution. As Dorothy left the federal courthouse that evening, she reflected on how completely the situation had transformed since that morning 6 months earlier when Marcus Sterling had dismissed her as a helpless elderly victim whose medical needs were less important than his political goals. Federal justice had proven once again that experience, patience, and proper legal process were more powerful than youth, wealth, and mob tactics. The federal sentencing hearing for Marcus Sterling took place on a gray December morning, exactly 1 year after Dorothy Parker had first encountered Climate Justice Now's harassment at the intersection of Oak and 3rd. Federal Judge William Harrison's courtroom was again packed with victims, federal agents, and legal observers who recognized they were witnessing a landmark moment in civil rights enforcement and activist accountability. Marcus Sterling's sentencing had been delayed for months, while federal prosecutors worked with Sterling family attorneys to negotiate restitution for the hundreds of victims who had suffered under Climate Justice Now's systematic harassment campaigns. The financial reckoning was staggering. Medical costs for delayed treatments, lost business revenue, relocation expenses for families driven from their homes, and punitive damages for constitutional violations. The total exceeded $4 million, most of which would come from the Sterling family's previously hidden assets. Dorothy sat with other victims in the front section of the courtroom, wearing the same dignified composure that had characterized her 30 years on the federal bench. She had been asked to provide a victim impact statement, and she had prepared remarks that would focus not on personal revenge, but on the systematic nature of Marcus's crimes and the need for consequences that would deter similar future violations. Federal sentencing guidelines for Marcus's convictions recommended 15 to 25 years in prison, but Judge Harrison had discretion to consider factors that could increase or decrease that range. The prosecution was seeking the maximum sentence based on the leadership role Marcus had played in the conspiracy, the vulnerability of his victims, and the interstate scope of his criminal enterprise. Marcus's defense team had spent months trying to frame their client as a misguided young idealist whose environmental passion had led him to make poor choices about tactics. They presented character witnesses who spoke about Marcus's intelligence, his genuine concern about climate change, and his potential for rehabilitation if given a second chance. The strategy might have worked in a local court where political sympathies could influence outcomes, but federal judges focus on facts and legal precedents rather than emotional appeals. When Judge Harrison called for victim impact statements, the testimony was powerful and devastating. Mrs. Chin spoke about the medical complications she had suffered when Climate Justice Now's blockades delayed her dialysis treatments. Her voice shook as she described the fear she had felt when protesters surrounded her at the clinic, calling her a climate criminal for seeking life-sustaining medical care. Maria Santos testified about the economic destruction that coordinated harassment had inflicted on her restaurant and her employees. "My workers are immigrants who depend on their jobs to support their families," she explained. "When Mr. Sterling's organization targeted my business, they weren't fighting climate change. They were attacking working people who had no power to fight back." The most powerful testimony came from Dorothy herself. As she approached the podium, she carried herself with the authority that had made her legendary among federal attorneys. Her statement was precise, factual, and devastating in its calm recitation of systematic civil rights violations. "Your Honor," Dorothy began, "this case represents more than individual crimes by a privileged young man who lost his way. It represents a systematic assault on constitutional principles that protect vulnerable Americans from harassment by people who believe their political goals justify illegal tactics." Dorothy detailed how Marcus's organization had specifically targeted elderly residents, working-class families, and small business owners because they were perceived as politically powerless. She explained how Climate Justice Now had coordinated across state lines to suppress opposition and silence criticism through intimidation and harassment. Mr. Sterling and his associates didn't commit crimes of passion or desperation, Dorothy continued. They committed calculated violations of federal law designed to terrorize vulnerable communities into submission. They used their wealth and political connections to avoid local accountability while systematically violating the civil rights of people who couldn't fight back effectively. Judge Harrison listened with the focused attention that Dorothy remembered from her own judicial experience. When Dorothy concluded her statement by recommending the maximum sentence to deter similar future violations, she could see that her words had the impact she intended. Marcus Sterling's own statement to the court was a study in privileged entitlement barely disguised as remorse. He apologized for tactics that went too far and claimed to have learned important lessons about balancing environmental urgency with respect for community concerns. He never acknowledged the systematic nature of his crimes or accepted responsibility for the calculated targeting of vulnerable populations. Judge Harrison's sentencing remarks demonstrated why federal courts command respect that local political processes often lack. "Mr. Sterling," the judge began, "this court recognizes your stated concern about environmental issues. However, environmental activism, like any other form of political expression, must operate within constitutional boundaries that protect all Americans from harassment and intimidation." Judge Harrison methodically reviewed the evidence of systematic targeting, interstate coordination, and calculated victim selection that had characterized Marcus's criminal enterprise. He noted that the crimes weren't impulsive mistakes, but deliberate strategies designed to suppress opposition through harassment and intimidation. The victims in this case were specifically chosen because you believe they lack the power to resist your organization's tactics, Judge Harrison continued. Elderly residents seeking medical care, working families trying to earn a living, small business owners serving their communities. These are the people you systematically targeted because you thought they were politically expendable. The sentence was swift and decisive: 22 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole before serving at least 18 years. Additional sentences for Marcus's associates ranged from 8 to 15 years, reflecting their roles in the conspiracy and their cooperation with federal investigators. The Sterling Family Foundation was ordered to pay full restitution to all identified victims, forfeit its tax-exempt status, and submit to federal monitoring of all future charitable activities. Sterling Technologies faced regulatory sanctions and federal oversight that would effectively end the family's political influence and business empire. As federal marshals led Marcus Sterling away to begin his prison sentence, Dorothy felt the satisfaction that comes from seeing justice properly administered through constitutional processes rather than mob tactics or political pressure. Marcus had learned too late that federal law doesn't recognize special exceptions for people who believe their noble goals justify ignoble tactics. The community response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Local news coverage focused on the precedent the case had established for protecting vulnerable populations from systematic harassment by wealthy activist organizations. Legal experts noted that the comprehensive federal prosecution would likely deter similar targeting campaigns in other cities. As Dorothy left the federal courthouse for the final time as a participant in the Sterling case, she reflected on the lesson that Marcus and his associates had learned at enormous personal cost. When you systematically target people based on their age, economic status, and perceived political powerlessness, you're not engaging in environmental activism. You're committing federal crimes that carry federal consequences. 2 years after Marcus Sterling began serving his federal prison sentence, Dorothy Parker found herself in a role she had never expected during her retirement: the architect of a national movement to protect vulnerable communities from systematic harassment disguised as political activism. The federal case that had begun with her harassment at a Portland intersection had evolved into comprehensive policy reforms that were being adopted by cities and law enforcement agencies across the country. The changes started in Portland itself, where the Sterling case had exposed the dangerous consequences of selective law enforcement based on political considerations. The new mayor, elected after James Wilson's resignation during the federal investigation, had implemented what local media called the Dorothy Parker Protocol, a comprehensive framework for managing protest activities that balanced First Amendment rights with equal protection for all community members. Under the new guidelines, protest permits required detailed plans for maintaining emergency vehicle access and minimizing impact on vulnerable populations. Elderly residents, medical facilities, and essential services received specific protections that couldn't be waived for political reasons. Most importantly, enforcement became consistent regardless of the protesters' political affiliations or financial connections. Dorothy had worked closely with city officials and federal authorities to develop these policies, drawing on her 3 decades of constitutional law experience to create frameworks that would withstand legal challenges while protecting community members from systematic targeting. The protocols had already prevented several attempted harassment campaigns by activist groups seeking to replicate climate justice now's tactics. The federal implications of the Sterling case extended far beyond Portland. The Department of Justice had established a civil rights protection unit specifically focused on preventing systematic targeting of vulnerable populations by politically motivated organizations. Federal prosecutors now had clear precedents and investigative tools for addressing what legal scholars were calling privileged activism, the use of political causes to justify harassment and intimidation tactics. Agent Sarah Kim, who had led the federal investigation of climate justice was now heading the new DOJ unit and training federal agents nationwide in the investigative techniques that had proven so effective in the Sterling case. Dorothy served as a consultant, helping federal authorities understand how systematic targeting operations could be identified and dismantled before they caused significant community damage. The Sterling case taught us that wealthy activist organizations can be just as dangerous to civil rights as traditional hate groups, Agent Kim explained during a training session Dorothy attended at the Federal Law Enforcement Academy. They use political legitimacy to hide systematic harassment, and they target victims who they believe won't have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. The training program emphasized the importance of thorough financial investigation, interstate coordination analysis, and victim protection protocols that have been pioneered during the Climate Justice Now investigation. Federal agents learned to recognize the warning signs of systematic targeting campaigns and to build comprehensive cases that could withstand First Amendment challenges. The tax fraud aspects of the Sterling case had also prompted comprehensive reforms in how the IRS monitored politically active charitable organizations. The Sterling Family Foundation's abuse of tax-exempt status to fund illegal activities had revealed widespread vulnerabilities in the oversight system that allowed wealthy families to use charitable deductions to finance harassment campaigns against their perceived enemies. New IRS regulations required detailed documentation of charitable activities and prohibited tax-exempt organizations from funding activities that violated federal civil rights laws. The reforms included mandatory reporting requirements and audit procedures specifically designed to identify organizations that claimed charitable status while engaging in systematic harassment or intimidation. Dorothy had testified before congressional committees about the need for these reforms, drawing on her federal judicial experience to explain how wealthy activist organizations could exploit legal loopholes to avoid accountability while systematically violating constitutional rights. Her congressional testimony had been instrumental in building bipartisan support for legislation that strengthened civil rights protections without compromising legitimate protest rights. The community impact of these policy changes was immediately apparent in Portland and other cities that had adopted similar protocols. Elderly residents reported feeling safer and more confident about accessing medical care and essential services. Small businesses that had been targeted by harassment campaigns were able to operate without fear of coordinated economic attacks. Working-class families could rely on public transportation and emergency services without worrying about systematic disruption. Dorothy had also helped establish a legal aid clinic specifically focused on protecting elderly residents and vulnerable communities from harassment by politically motivated organizations. The clinic provided free legal assistance to victims of systematic targeting and worked with federal authorities to identify and prosecute organizations that violated civil rights laws. The clinic's success had led to the creation of similar programs in dozens of cities where activists had attempted to replicate Climate Justice Now's targeting tactics. These programs provided vulnerable communities with the legal expertise and federal connections needed to resist harassment campaigns before they could cause significant damage. Perhaps most importantly, the Sterling case had changed how legitimate environmental and social justice organizations approach their activism. Responsible activist groups now emphasize community engagement, coalition building, and inclusive strategies that protected vulnerable populations rather than targeting them for political pressure. Dorothy had worked with several environmental organizations to develop ethical guidelines for protest activities that respected civil rights, while effectively advocating for policy changes. These guidelines emphasize the importance of building broad community support rather than alienating potential allies through harassment and intimidation tactics. The national legal community had also taken notice of the precedents established by the Sterling case. Law schools now taught courses on civil rights enforcement that used Dorothy's investigation and the federal prosecution as case studies in effective community organizing and constitutional law application. Dorothy regularly spoke at legal conferences and law schools about the lessons learned from the Climate Justice Now investigation. Her presentations emphasized the importance of thorough documentation, strategic patience, and understanding how federal law enforcement differed from local political processes. The most important lesson from the Sterling case, Dorothy often told her audiences, is that civil rights protections are meaningless unless they're consistently enforced regardless of the political affiliations or stated goals of the violators. Environmental activism doesn't exempt anyone from constitutional obligations to respect other people's rights. The reforms that had emerged from the Sterling case represented a fundamental shift in how law enforcement and legal professionals approached politically motivated harassment. The systematic targeting of vulnerable populations was now recognized as a serious federal crime that warranted comprehensive investigation and prosecution regardless of the political justifications offered by perpetrators. As Dorothy reviewed the national impact of the case that had begun with her harassment at a Portland intersection, she reflected on how individual resistance to injustice could create systemic changes that protected entire communities from systematic abuse by wealthy and politically connected organizations that believed their noble goals justified ignoble tactics. 5 years after her confrontation with Marcus Sterling at a Portland intersection, Dorothy Parker received a phone call that would have seemed impossible when she was sitting in her Honda Civic, surrounded by angry protesters who thought an elderly woman's heart medication was less important than their political theater. The caller was the director of the American Civil Liberties Union, asking Dorothy to accept their highest honor for civil rights advocacy and community protection. Judge Parker, the director explained, "Your work on the Sterling case has fundamentally changed how we approach the balance between protest rights and civil rights protection. You've shown that defending constitutional principles sometimes means holding activists accountable to the same standards we apply to other organizations that systematically target vulnerable populations." The ACLU recognition was just one of many honors Dorothy had received as the national impact of the Sterling case continued to expand. Legal organizations, civil rights groups, and community advocacy organizations had all recognized her work in developing new frameworks for protecting vulnerable populations from systematic harassment while preserving legitimate protest rights. The annual Conference of Federal Judges had asked Dorothy to deliver the keynote address on civil rights enforcement in the modern era. Standing before an audience of her former colleagues, Dorothy reflected on how much the legal landscape had changed since her retirement. The Sterling case had become required reading in law schools, and federal prosecutors now had comprehensive tools for addressing systematic targeting campaigns that had been developed directly from her documentation and investigation methods. The Sterling case taught us that civil rights violations don't always come from traditional sources, Dorothy told the assembled federal judges. Sometimes they come from people who claim to be fighting for justice while systematically denying justice to others. Our constitutional obligations don't change based on the political affiliations or stated goals of the violators. The federal prosecutors who had built the case against Climate Justice Now had all received promotions and national recognition for their work. Patricia Chun was now a federal judge herself, appointed after her successful prosecution of Marcus Sterling and related cases. Agent Sarah Kim headed the expanded Civil Rights Protection Unit that was now investigating similar organizations in dozens of cities across the country. The ripple effects of the Sterling prosecution had led to federal investigations and prosecutions of activist organizations that had adopted similar systematic targeting tactics. In Seattle, a group calling itself Economic Justice Now was dismantled after federal agents discovered they were using Climate Justice Now's playbook to harass small business owners in immigrant communities. In Denver, Housing Justice Coalition leaders were convicted of federal conspiracy charges for systematically targeting elderly homeowners to force property sales to their developer allies. Each new case built on the legal precedents and investigative techniques that had been pioneered during the Sterling investigation. Federal prosecutors now had clear guidelines for distinguishing between protected political speech and systematic civil rights violations, and federal agents had proven methods for building comprehensive cases against organizations that used political activism to hide criminal enterprises. The academic impact of the Sterling case was equally significant. Universities across the country had established research programs studying what scholars were calling privileged activism, the phenomenon of wealthy, politically connected organizations using social justice rhetoric to justify harassment and intimidation tactics against vulnerable populations. Dorothy had been invited to serve as a visiting professor at several law schools, teaching courses on civil rights enforcement and community advocacy. Her classes consistently drew overflow crowds of students who wanted to understand how individual citizens could effectively resist systematic harassment while working within constitutional frameworks to create lasting change. The most important lesson from the Sterling case, Dorothy often told her students, is that knowledge of the law and patience in applying it properly can be more powerful than wealth, political connections, or mob tactics. But you have to be willing to do the work, document everything carefully, and trust that federal institutions will eventually respond to clear evidence of constitutional violations. The international legal community had also taken notice of the Sterling case precedents. European legal scholars studying the balance between protest rights and civil rights protection had cited Dorothy's work in developing new frameworks for addressing systematic targeting campaigns. Several countries had modified their own civil rights enforcement procedures based on techniques that had been pioneered during the Climate Justice Now investigation. Marcus Sterling himself had become a cautionary tale taught in business schools and political science programs as an example of how privilege and political connections couldn't protect someone from federal consequences when they systematically violated constitutional rights. His 22-year federal prison sentence served as a deterrent to other wealthy activists who might be tempted to use harassment and intimidation tactics against vulnerable communities. The Sterling family's business empire had never recovered from the federal investigation and prosecution. Sterling Technologies had lost most of its government contracts and faced ongoing regulatory scrutiny that had effectively ended the family's political influence. The Sterling Family Foundation had been dissolved, and the family's assets had been largely liquidated to pay restitution to the hundreds of victims who had suffered under Climate Justice Now's systematic harassment campaigns. Dorothy's own role in these changes had evolved beyond what she had ever expected during her federal judicial career. She had become a national expert on community-based civil rights advocacy, consulting with federal agencies, training law enforcement personnel, and helping vulnerable communities develop the knowledge and connections needed to resist systematic harassment. The legal aid clinic Dorothy had helped establish in Portland had become a model for similar programs in dozens of cities. These clinics provided free legal assistance to elderly residents, working-class families, and small business owners who were targeted by harassment campaigns, while also working with federal authorities to identify and prosecute organizations that violated civil rights laws. Perhaps most satisfying for Dorothy was the community impact of the changes that had emerged from her confrontation with Marcus Sterling. Elderly residents throughout Portland and other cities reported feeling safer and more confident about accessing medical care, public transportation, and essential services. The systematic targeting campaigns that had characterized Climate Justice Now's approach were now recognized as serious federal crimes that warranted comprehensive investigation and prosecution. As Dorothy prepared for the ACLU ceremony where she would receive recognition for her civil rights advocacy, she reflected on the journey that had begun when Marcus Sterling dismissed her as a helpless elderly victim whose medical needs were less important than his political goals. The young man who had thought wealth and political connections made him untouchable was now serving a federal prison sentence, while the elderly woman he had tried to intimidate had become a national symbol of effective resistance to systematic harassment and constitutional rights protection. 10 years after Dorothy Parker first encountered Marcus Sterling at the intersection of Oak and 3rd, she found herself making the same drive on a crisp Tuesday morning in October. At 88 years old, she still maintained her independence behind the wheel of her Honda Civic, though she now drove more slowly and carefully than she had in her younger days. The route that had once been a source of anxiety and harassment had become a peaceful reminder of how much can change when one person refuses to be intimidated by those who believe their wealth and political connections place them above the law. The intersection where Marcus Sterling had dismissed her medical needs and spat on her windshield was now marked with a small plaque recognizing the Dorothy Parker Civil Rights Protection Zone, a designation that required special protocols for any protest activities in the area. Emergency vehicles maintained priority access, elderly residents received enhanced protection, and any activist organization seeking permits had to demonstrate compliance with federal civil rights guidelines that had emerged from a Sterling case. As Dorothy approached the intersection, she noticed a small group of environmental protesters gathered on the sidewalk with signs advocating for renewable energy and carbon emission reductions. The demonstration was orderly, permitted, and carefully managed to avoid the systematic targeting tactics that had characterized Climate Justice Now's operations. The protesters had coordinated with city officials to ensure emergency vehicle access, and they were working with community leaders to build support rather than alienating potential allies through harassment and intimidation. The transformation represented everything Dorothy had hoped to achieve when she began her methodical campaign against Marcus Sterling's criminal organization. Legitimate environmental activism was thriving in Portland and across the country, but it now operated within constitutional boundaries that protected vulnerable populations from systematic harassment and targeting. Dorothy parked her car and walked slowly to the pharmacy where she had been denied access a decade earlier. The building now housed a community health clinic that served elderly residents and working-class families, funded in part by restitution payment from the dissolved Sterling Family Foundation. The clinic provided not only medical care, but also legal assistance for residents who faced harassment or discrimination from any source. Inside the clinic, Dorothy was greeted by Dr. Maria Santos, the same Maria whose restaurant had been targeted by Climate Justice Now's harassment campaigns. Maria had used the federal restitution payments to complete medical school and return to the community as a physician dedicated to serving vulnerable populations. Her clinic had become a model for community-based healthcare that addressed both medical needs and civil rights protection. Judge Parker, Maria said with genuine warmth, perfect timing. Mrs. Chun is here for her weekly checkup, and she always asks about you. Mrs. Chun, now 92 years old, had become something of a local celebrity after her powerful testimony during Marcus Sterling's federal trial. Her description of being harassed while seeking dialysis treatment had helped federal prosecutors demonstrate the human cost of systematic targeting campaigns. She had used her newfound platform to advocate for elderly rights and civil rights protection, becoming a regular speaker at law schools and civil rights conferences. Dorothy, Mrs. Chun said with a smile that had grown more confident over the years, I was just telling Dr. Santos about the wonderful letter we received from that young man in Seattle. You remember, the one whose group adopted our community organizing principles instead of following the old harassment model. The letter was from a legitimate environmental organization that had specifically rejected the systematic targeting approach that had characterized groups like Climate Justice Now. Instead of harassing vulnerable populations, they had built coalitions with elderly residents, working-class families, and small business owners to advocate for environmental policies that protected both the planet and the people who lived on it. The environmental movement had largely reformed itself in response to the legal precedents and public scrutiny that had emerged from the Sterling case. Responsible activist organizations now emphasized inclusive coalition building, community engagement, and respect for civil rights as fundamental principles of effective advocacy. The systematic targeting of vulnerable populations had become recognized as both legally dangerous and strategically counterproductive. As Dorothy visited with Mrs. Chun and Dr. Santos, she reflected on the comprehensive changes that had emerged from her confrontation with Marcus Sterling. The federal civil rights enforcement mechanisms that had been developed during the Climate Justice Now investigation were now protecting vulnerable communities across the country. The legal aid clinics and community organizing programs that had grown out of the Portland case were operating in dozens of cities. The academic and legal frameworks for understanding and preventing systematic targeting campaigns had become standard components of civil rights education and law enforcement training. Marcus Sterling himself remained in federal prison, with 8 more years remaining on his sentence. His case had become a standard example in federal prosecutor training programs of how wealth and political connections couldn't protect criminals who systematically violated constitutional rights. His former associates had been released after serving their sentences, but their careers in activism and politics had been permanently destroyed by their federal convictions. The Sterling family's business empire had never recovered from the federal investigation and restitution payments. Sterling Technologies had been sold to pay victims compensation, and the family had largely disappeared from public life. The cautionary tale of their downfall was now taught in business schools and political science programs as an example of how privilege and political connections had limits when faced with federal law enforcement and constitutional accountability. As Dorothy prepared to leave the clinic, she encountered a group of young law students who were volunteering with the legal aid program. They recognized her immediately and asked for advice about protecting vulnerable communities from harassment and intimidation tactics. The most important lesson, Dorothy told them, is that knowledge of the law and patience in applying it properly can defeat any amount of wealth, political connections, or mob tactics. But you have to be willing to do the work, document everything carefully, and trust that federal institutions will eventually respond to clear evidence of constitutional violations. One of the students asked how she had maintained her resolve during the months of harassment and intimidation that had preceded Marcus Sterling's arrest. Dorothy smiled as she remembered the fear and isolation she had felt when protesters surrounded her car and dismissed her medical needs as less important than their political goals. "I had help," Dorothy replied. Mrs. Chun, Dr. Santos, and dozens of other community members who refused to be intimidated by people who thought their noble goals justified ignoble tactics. Individual resistance is important, but community organizing and mutual support are what create lasting change. As Dorothy drove home through downtown Portland, she passed the intersection where her journey had begun and reflected on the lesson that Marcus Sterling had learned at enormous personal cost. When you systematically target people based on their age, economic status, and perceived political powerlessness, you're not engaging in environmental activism or social justice advocacy. You're committing federal crimes that carry federal consequences. And sometimes the elderly woman whose medical needs you dismiss as unimportant turns out to be someone who spent 30 years learning exactly how to use federal law to destroy people who think they're untouchable. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't silencing your opponents. It's teaching them that their cause doesn't justify targeting people who can't fight back. And if you're facing activists who think their noble goals excuse ignoble tactics, remember, the most powerful response isn't anger or confrontation. It's patient documentation and the wisdom to know exactly when and how to use the law as your weapon.